One velvet-sealed envelope departed Buckingham Palace early one winter morning, initiating a reckoning that the monarchy had long postponed. It was more than just a remark. It was a revelation that had been building for years. The last, devastating blow to Prince Harry came from his father, rather than the media or the palace. It's the kind that lingers long after the seal is shattered, without making a loud explosion. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. The envelope was thoughtful, not hurried. The entire weight of the crown was on two silent letters that were hand-selected, hand-sealed, and signed. Charles R. No assistants were permitted to write it. The language was not softened by any means. A committee did not make this choice. After years of silence, it was a king's decision to speak in his own words. Its destiny was just as deliberate. Not a palace, not a court. However, a law office in California, thousands of miles from the stone walls, is typically where decisions on royal history are made. There was no negotiation or warning when it arrived. It arrived as finality. It contained confirmation that Meghan Markle has lost all of her royal connections, not briefly, not metaphorically, but entirely. The globe exploded within minutes. Commentators conjectured, news alerts flashed, and social media split into acclaim and indignation. One item, however, was still locked away in the midst of the chaos. Apart from the actual letter's contents, the words Charles selected, the realities he at last consented to put on writing. Since Buckingham Palace was not leaking, that quiet was more powerful than any headline. It was holding the line for once. The rumors started right away inside the royal corridors. This was not a political issue. Optics has nothing to do with this. This was a private matter. Employees who had witnessed scandals, divorces, and abdications felt the difference. It had a colder tone. However, the motivation was more compelling. This was not an institution being defended by a king. The father was at the limit of his endurance. Insiders were particularly uneasy with Meghan's response, or rather, her lack thereof. There was no prompt reaction from her legal team, no well-crafted denial, no appeal to the emotions, just quiet. Furthermore, silence is never meaningless in royal parlance. It's strategic. It implied that something more profound had been discovered, something that could not be disregarded by declarations or legal action. Officially, the palace presented the action as a necessary correction, a protection, and preservation rather than punishment. However, those who were close to Charles were aware that the truth had a more pointed edge. Grief, not rage or retaliation, existed underlying the formalities. Sadness for a broken family that was beyond repair, and for a son who was now on the opposite side of a choice his father was unable to put off. At this point, the monarchy decided to draw a line rather than continue to endure the blows. Silently, forever. We must go beyond the headlines and into the heart of a parent, watching his legacy fall apart, in order to comprehend why Charles ultimately crossed that line and why he made this decision now rather than earlier. King Charles used quiet as a shield for years. He chose to refrain from taking revenge after witnessing the mayhem all around him, including the headlines, interviews, and staged grins. He saw silence as a sign of control rather than weakness. However, that stillness started to decay from the inside out as the months passed. The crown was no longer protected by it. It was in danger of suffocating it. And it became evident that quiet was no longer a diplomatic tactic when Meghan Markle's next endeavor revealed something so bold and strategic. It was now being used against him as a weapon. The documentary Behind the Crown, which was purportedly presented as Meghan's most recent media endeavor, hit royal offices like a bombshell. Not out of respect, not through the proper means. However, Leaks revealed that the plan, which was created for global streaming services, offered dramatic depictions of private moments, reenactments of royal life, and access to emotional aspects of the monarchy that had never been approved for public viewing. Rumors circulated about sequences showing private talks, private palace ceremonies, and even spoofs of the Queen and Prince Philip's resurrected personas, not with respect, but with dramatic license. It wasn't a documentary. It was fiction masquerading as reality. It was the line that could no longer be disregarded by those in Buckingham Palace. Even more unsettling was discovered when royal investigators, operating covertly under the Office of Sovereign Inspection, went through the proposal's attachments. Unreleased foot purportedly acquired from back-channel communications, implanted recordings, and former employees. The script outlined a number of intimate family events that had never been seen before. How did she obtain them? Who had assisted her? And why were they being incorporated into a story that was being sold? Suddenly, it was more than just contentment as these inquiries echoed across the royal walls. It has to do with control. Or rather, the loss of it for the monarchy. When Princess Anne approached her brother, the mood changed. Throughout the drama, Anne, who was renowned for her unwavering devotion to tradition, had kept her advice close. She didn't wait for an invitation this time, though. Her message was blunt. Rebellion is not what this is. It's reinvention at our expense. She wasn't only talking about Meghan. She was referring to the growing trend of principles, duty, and dignity gradually being separated from royal identity. To Anne, it was no longer a domestic fracture. It was a hijacking of an institution. By then, King Charles had already tried everything. Individual handwritten letters, written alone. Hopeful invitations were sent out. Assistants received messages asking for nothing more than a meeting, just family, without cameras or confrontation. The identical response was given to each attempt, silence. Redirection through legal teams is even worse. It seems that Meghan and Harry had built walls of intent as well as geography. Not only was the monarch being disregarded, but he was also being sidestepped. What many suspected was soon confirmed by internal briefings held within the palace. There was no miscommunication here. There was a movement. Meghan wasn't only keeping her distance from the throne. Its place in her story was being rewritten. She also left behind replacement rather than absence with each stride she took. The monarchy has evolved into the background rather than the lens, a supporting cast in a story about power, independence, and upheaval. Charles's closest friends and family saw the change with growing fear. The man who had formerly supported diplomacy in the face of ridicule and believed in second chances was now facing an unavoidable reality. His once accurately controlled silence has become an echo chamber of uncontrollable chaos. Every letter that goes unanswered, each invitation was turned down. His reign had been weakened by each calculated silence. Thus, the storm that had been gradually and silently intensifying reached its peak. Charles no longer questioned the propriety of taking action. Why had it taken him so long to see the truth, he wondered? Because the betrayal that broke the king was not Meghan's manufactured fantasy. It was the quiet of a person he used to call his own son. However, Harry's silence was what really broke Charles, not what Meghan captured on camera. A parent is said to be able to overlook anything, with the exception of his own son's decision to remain silent. Harry's absence during the storm wasn't neutrality to Charles. It was the quietest kind of treachery, and even the king's composure broke as the agony peaked. Charles's realization that reconciliation was becoming unattainable came in the form of a letter that wasn't formal, delivered by aides, or bound by convention. The king himself wrote it by hand. In the seclusion of his own study, he wrote, "There was no royal insignia on it, not a hint of authority, just a father's frantic attempt to speak to his son. Charles merely signed it as Dad, not Your Majesty. The brief but sincere letter was honest and offered no justifications. He made one request of Harry in it, not consent, not endorsement, but comprehension. It was painful for the monarchy. He was too. Silence ensued for weeks, no call, no response. Finally, a reply, but Harry wasn't the source. It was from Meghan's attorney, a clinical document devoid of emotion, replete with clauses, disclaimers, and chilly formalities. The emotional appeal was ignored. It made no mention of the letter at all. Only one issue was addressed in the response: the legal limits on damage to one's reputation and intellectual property. No mention of family at all. Not a word about the father who had previously held that very youngster through all the ups and downs of boyhood. Charles read it once. On the other hand, the room appeared to be quieter than before when he put it down. His aides instantly saw the difference behind the palace walls. Charles wasn't upset. He felt emptied out. He was characterized as shaken to the marrow during a private discussion with senior advisors. "I no longer know where my son ends and the brand begins," he said, his voice breaking. He was no longer faced with a political choice. It was a breakdown of emotions. He had acted more like a parent than a king. He had also gotten a contract in exchange. He had a private meeting with Prince William and Princess Anne that same day. Anne, who was renowned for her brutal clarity and discipline, didn't hold back. "This silence is calculated," she stated firmly. "There isn't any hesitancy. It's a tactic. Every time we wait, we're losing more than championships," William continued, sounding as worried. "We are losing our sense of self." Once hopeful of a reconciliation, the palace was now prepared for a reckoning. At that point, Charles started writing once more, but it wasn't a letter. It had been a draft this time, an official draft. Anything that cannot be undone. Only a select handful were aware of the internal code name. A last barrier separating legacy and love. It had nothing to do with retaliation. It had nothing to do with punishment. It was a line drawn out of suffering, a paper that would ultimately disentangle the organization from the delusion. It was the start of a conclusion Charles never desired, but was now unable to avoid. Charles, however, reopened a collection of sealed letters that would serve as his moral compass, something he hadn't touched since his mother's burial, before the order was signed. Queen Elizabeth II's handwritten notes, never intended for public consumption but now bearing the weight of royal prophecy, were buried deep within the royal archives. "What one turns into content, one no longer honors," she cautioned Charles in one. Up until now, he had disregarded her. When Charles opened the black-laced box that had been left in his private study following the Queen's funeral, the atmosphere was silent. There were scores of personal letters addressed to him in her steady, familiar writing, all wrapped in faded ribbon. The majority had plain labels, but some had additional markings, just for Charles's eyes. The memos were not royal. They were briefings for mothers. A royal mother's reflections are handed on to her son, the heir, and the future. At the moment, he hadn't read them. Too loud had been grief, but now, in the confusion of silence and treachery, Charles grasped for what he had before been unwilling to see. The Queen's wisdom was revealed in every letter, which was composed with unshakable foresight rather than rage. Neither the Netflix drama nor the Oprah interview had sparked her worry about Meghan. It had begun much earlier when she observed a trend, a change in the way the monarchy was portrayed and used. Elizabeth recognized the warning signs. Meghan's quick rise in international media wasn't just due to her influence, it was change. She warned about the perils of confusing presence for power and using legacy as leverage. In one note she had written, "Royalty must reverberate through silence, not scream through scripts." There was one letter that stood out. On the envelope, there was just one sentence and no date. "Don't be noisy. Act when the time is right. Inside, the Queen had expressed her greatest concern that the monarchy would eventually become a narrative dominated by people who were no longer devoted to its ideals. She compared it to the turmoil that almost brought down the monarchy when Edward VIII abdicated, and referred to it as a labeled insurrection. It wouldn't be one man giving up the throne for love, she said. A family would sacrifice their legacy for show. Charles read through tear-streaked passages that described resolve, as well as worry. She mentioned her early encounters with Meghan in one of her notes. She had anticipated the newcomer would bring respect to the firm's modernization. Instead, she saw a distraction and disarming charisma. Accompanied by a goal too big to drop, these were cautions left in trust, not charges, to a son who might require them in the future, but it was a shorter line that broke him. It was almost the conclusion of one of her last letters. "Loyalty," she wrote, "frequently dons the modernism mask. Don't mistake noise for advancement." Charles cried aloud, not just for his mother, but also for the length of time he had put off following her advice. He had worked to keep the family together for years, favoring diplomacy over judgment. However, something changed at that precise time. The crown's weight returned, this time as a calling rather than a burden. Heartbreak was no longer a factor in this. It has to do with heritage. And the foundation of a fresh resolution was Elizabeth's letters, which were full with insight gathered over many years. Charles could no longer afford to be the brother who waited or the parent who hoped. The Queen had made it plain that he was the king. The institution ran the risk of becoming an anecdote in someone else's documentary the longer he waited. Charles therefore called in the silent revolutionaries of the crown, the architects of Order 17A, with the Queen's approval blazing in his head. A secret project that would permanently alter the monarchy was taking place behind gleaming gates and royal smiles. Order 17A is the code name. This was not revenge. It was a conflict waged with royal sword, precedent, and parchment. It started out as whispers, spoken in hallways rather than courtrooms. Lady Margaret Ashcombe, a constitutional scholar renowned for her surgical precision, was approached by Princess Anne, who was recognized for her unwavering allegiance and quiet resolve. They forged a structural connection rather than a sentimental one. They witnessed what others were afraid to publicly identify. The monarchy was losing power due of strategic deterioration rather than scandal. Meghan's absence wasn't the only thing. It was the way she had transformed monarchy into marketable currency and departure into branding. What the public hadn't seen was revealed by Lady Margaret's team through an internal audit. Meghan's business website wasn't just a coincidence. It was extensive, well-organized, and purposeful. From publishing agreements to podcasts, from subliminal allusions in cosmetics advertisements to trademark applications filed under Sussex Global, it became evident that the royal title was being exploited rather than respected. The Sussex identity has evolved into a business symbol, detached from responsibility but rooted in perception. Furthermore, perception was powerful in the digital age. At that point, the most crucial sentence was created with the serene brutality of a surgeon's hand: the clause on digital sovereignty. The monarchy has never issued anything like it. Without official permission, this clause prohibited the use of names, pictures, and connections drawn from royals in any commercial place. Censorship was not involved. It was a containment strategy. In a world where allegiance might be manipulated, sold, and live-streamed, this firewall is essential. However, the document could not afford to be resentful. It had to be unwavering, emotionless, accurate, and impenetrable. Despite not being a lawyer, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was discreetly asked to check the tone. The structure remained unchanged by her. Her changes, which were forceful but dignified, subtle but potent, improved the spirit. She insisted on eliminating any personal references in favor of emphasizing responsibility, legacy, and safety. Her revisions made sure that no one could confuse resolution with retaliation while maintaining the monarchy's moral superiority. The final version of Order 17A was prepared following weeks of changes. Meghan wasn't the only issue. It evolved into the structure that would reinterpret what it meant to be a member of the royal family. Every 5 years, a title would now be reconsidered. Any attempt to commercialize the monarchy without control would be viewed as a clear violation of crown integrity, and non-working royals would be subject to a status freeze. Then the moment that would change the course of royal history arrived. King Charles was shown the 87-page manuscript in a sealed folio. Every word was read by him. He then signed it without any fanfare or ceremony, Charles R. This was the first revocation order he issued on his own since taking the monarch. It was finished, in complete clarity, not in rage. The boundary had been drawn by the crown. However, something much more intimate was about to happen while the legal machinery was in motion, and it would bring Harry to tears. Just a father's quivering hand and a pen that was heavier than any scepter. No crown, no cameras. The final tie between father and son was severed by the letter Charles wrote to Harry after signing Order 17A, even though it was never intended for the world to see. It was penned alone in the silence of a study that had once reverberated with recollections of better times. There were no consultants present, and it was not vetted by any protocol. Charles turned down assistance. The words have to be his own. Not formal, not political, yet intimate. This was no king speaking to a duke. This was a final letter from a father to his kid. Every line showed the pain in the ink. He admitted that he had been waiting too long. Perhaps foolishly, he had hoped that Meghan would eventually realize the sacredness of the crown she had left behind. Harry would be able to distinguish between simply leaving a title and destroying its meaning. But he was sure about one thing. Vengeance was never the goal here. It was never about turning away from love. It was about keeping a centuries-old legacy intact. He wrote, "I did not revoke your marriage. A mirror that no longer reflected the crown was revoked by me." Then he extended the last remaining olive branch in a final statement that carried the weight of a kingdom's grief. If the son I knew comes back without the mask, the door is still open. Harry didn't open the letter right away when it got to California. He was unable to. He stared at the envelope for hours, according to those close to him. He cried, although not in public, when he eventually read it. Not in a big way, but in the quiet of one who understood how far they had strayed. The words pierced years of uncertainty. The burden of what had been lost briefly fell upon his shoulders. Even so, the sound of counsel stepped in. Meghan, calm and forceful, apparently asked for no response. It would agitate the media, she claimed. It wouldn't alter the result, she claimed. Unread by the public and unanswered by the addressee, the letter was folded away. The hush in Buckingham Palace was overwhelming. Perhaps stupidly, aides had thought that Harry would react with emotion rather than a lot of hoopla. However, days stretched into weeks. Nothing arrived. What few dared to say out loud was corroborated by insiders. At this point, the relationship was no longer functioning. Nevertheless, Charles stored the duplicate letters in his own drawer, not as a point of reference, but as a warning that love must eventually turn into boundaries when it encounters stillness. He never mentioned it again. Not to Anne, not to William. Those closest to him, however, saw a shift. The father had bid farewell. The monarch had established his boundaries, and the monarchy started rewriting its new chapter while Harry sat silently, one based on healing rather than retaliation. A new duchess arises in silence as the previous one is removed from the royal record. Once the underappreciated Windsor, Lady Louise now walks next to Anne, not as a substitute, but as a reminder that responsibility comes before drama. The palace made no announcements or held a press conference following Meghan's official withdrawal, when the media was ablaze with rumors and indignation. Lady Louise Windsor was sent instead, to simply appear with Princess Anne at occasions that had no glitz, only a purpose, without speaking or acting. The two were observed carrying out their responsibilities with cool calmness at everything from community visits in Lincolnshire to military commemorations in Yorkshire. There was no mistaking the message. Fire was not being fought with fire by the monarchs. With presence, trust was being restored. The crowd was taken aback by Louise's manner rather than her appearance. She provided authenticity in a spectacle-obsessed age. Louise provided quiet, humility, and service, while Meghan had made her narrative a worldwide brand. After being inundated with royal scandal, social media started subtly changing its tone. Trending hashtags praised Louise's poise. Articles began to appear that contrasted Meghan's media endeavors with her quiet strength. She had said nothing in public. She was, however, being heard louder than before. Inside the palace, long-dormant conversations started to rekindle. Once intended to honor service and heritage, the title of Duchess of Edinburgh had remained unresolved. However, a name had subtly climbed to the top of that list now that Prince Philip was no longer with them, and the royal ranks had been reduced by scandal: Louise. Not quite yet. It wouldn't be announced in a headline. However, aides attested to the authenticity of the discussions. She is the future, not because she asked for it, but because she earned it, Princess Anne reportedly told Charles and the Privy Council while engaging in covert lobbying. The change was reflected in approval ratings. Polls revealed a significant increase in public support for both Lady Louise and Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The two stood for something that the monarchy sorely needed: elegance without entitlement, stability without haughtiness. Together, they served as the emotional pillars of a shattered organization that was still struggling to get its bearings. Aides observed a slight alteration in Charles's private study. Someone had put a fresh photo on his desk, a candid frame rather than a grandiose portrait. During the placement of a remembrance wreath, Anne and Louise stood side by side with their heads slightly bent. It was more than sentiment to those who witnessed it. The silent pillars were symbolic, taking the place of those that had crumbled under the strain of battle. Thus, the crown changed its emotional allegiance without making a declaration or holding a procession. It stopped searching for indications of reconciliation in California. For indications of rebirth, it turned to Windsor. Meghan's downfall was due to comparison more than scandal, and without being asked, Louise had risen as a symbol of what was left, not as a rescuer. However, a final twist that is concealed in plain sight and poised to blow out appears just as the monarchy is starting to recover. The interviews weren't the problem. It wasn't the tears from Netflix. The spreadsheet was the culprit. Beneath Meghan's sentimental stories, the royal auditors discovered something much more disturbing: an empire constructed on top of the crown rather than next to it. A confidential report arrived on King Charles's desk from the Royal Treasury Office, which is closed. The weight it held would alter everything, even though it wasn't marked urgent. The report, which was put together over the course of a 9-month inquiry by palace auditors, came to a direct conclusion. Meghan's stint in the monarchy was not the only source of inspiration for her post-royal endeavors. They were driven by it, organized around it, and made money off of it. A financial paradigm that viewed the monarchy as a marketing tool rather than a relic was at the center of it all. According to documents that were leaked, Meghan's California-based legal team had calculated brand equity returns that were directly associated with the Sussex name. These were not theoretical projections. They were supported by data analytics that linked increases in product engagement to news mentions, anniversaries of royal events, and family milestones. Her brand campaigns weren't operating on their own. They were enjoying the symbolism, controversies, and quiet of palace life as they danced to its beat. Investigators discovered a trend: product debuts, whether they be charity speeches, children's books, or podcast episodes, frequently correspond with royal news cycles. William's environmental summits, Catherine's public appearances, and even the Queen's funeral. Strategic declarations from Sussex somewhat echoed those occasions. It felt like orchestration now instead of coincidence. The heartbreak, exclusion, emancipation, and emotional journeys were more than just personal tales. They were content models, which were followed by targeted brand announcements, press coverage, and scheduled drops. Internal leaks of marketing pitch decks yielded the most devastating discovery. According to reports, some had stylized renditions of the royal crest that were clearly derived but gradually smudged and artistically reinvented. Others cited occasions that Meghan never went to in public, but that were used as a setting to establish the authority of the story. Images of royal interiors and event likenesses combined with branded statements were the most startling of all, giving the impression of support when none actually existed. It appeared that the crown had been used as a costume, and without realizing it, the monarchy had ended up serving as the background for another person's franchise. However, it wasn't a legal infraction that deeply affected Charles. It was erosion of philosophy. Days later, a second report came in. Royal economic advisors produced a financial study. What had transpired was quantified, not in charges, but in numbers. The conversion of royal dignity into digital capital was calculated. The spreadsheets had a clinical, frigid feel. However, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Sussex brand had used the monarchy's silence to its advantage, skillfully turning suffering into revenue. Charles was not angry when he turned to the last page. He shed tears. Not because the institution had been compromised, nor because the titles had been used unfairly. However, the story had been drastically altered, without permission and with startling clarity. He had thought that reconciliation was possible. He had awaited comprehension. However, there was no miscommunication. It was a tactic, carried out with scripts rather than swords. Thus, as the entire world watched, Charles stood in front of the last mirror, prepared to declare the truth, not as a king, but as a parent who was grieving. No more murmurs, no more quiet. "This is not the end of family," said King Charles, as he stood in Windsor's private chapel, which was only illuminated by a stained glass window. "Truth is just getting started." With that, the monarchy flipped the page, leaving behind the shadow of what might have been an addition to Meghan. A press conference was not held. There was no public broadcast of it. However, Charles gave what would become the monarchy's silent reckoning inside Windsor's huge stone gates, with only his closest relatives and advisors present. Despite his serious tone, his voice was full of conviction. He claimed that the experience they had all gone through was a crucible, rather than merely a crisis, one that made the price of inactivity clear. The outcome of clinging too long to the idea that betrayal could be overcome by love alone. Charles acknowledged that we allowed sentiment to stall sovereignty, and that we now repay that debt with vigilance, rather than retaliation. Those phrases indicated a new doctrine rather than its development in the Manslevers and Twelveness Node. For the future as well as the present, thus, a new body was created, the Office of Windsor Integrity. It had a clear mandate: keep an eye on, safeguard, and maintain the crown's identity. For the first time, the monarchy will not wait for storms to pass. In a world where tradition can be converted into popular content and influence can easily weaponized, it would construct things to withstand them. Reactive damage control is no longer used. The royal institution would henceforth act purposefully and deliberately, Once obscured by doubt, the succession line was now unmistakable. Anne's unwavering determination, William and Catherine's grounded strength. Louise is now discreetly taking over as the conscience of the contemporary monarch. These weren't only relatives. Inspired by what had been lost, they were the guardians of a legacy. They stood for tenacity rather than perfection. They would also have the responsibility of protecting the monarchy from inside in addition to advancing it. The last ceremonial act then took place. Once embossed with the title Duchess of Sussex, a parchment card in the royal archives bears the official marking, "Ceased by royal directive." It became one of several royal titles, and was only retired in the most dire situations. However, this wasn't a penalty. It was a conclusion. The monarchy was safeguarding its future, not discarding the past. Meghan issued a well-crafted remark across the Atlantic. It discussed compassion, empowerment, and unwavering dedication. Notably, though, she made no mention of Charles at all. She made no mention of the family she had previously joined. That omission sent more information to royal insiders than any counterargument could. The rift was now marked in history, acknowledged, accepted, and sealed rather than waiting to be repaired. That night, Charles went back to Highgrove and strolled by himself around the icy grounds. He appeared older, according to many who saw him. Indeed, but lighter as well. A man who had finally made the decision to strengthen what was left, rather than wait for an apology that would never materialize. He had lost something that could never be replaced. He did, however, regain clarity. And even if Windsor is covered with frost, the crown is not damaged. Thank you for viewing. Remember to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next one.